Simon Heffer, the historian, journalist and all-round commentator, is my special guest. Thank you very much for coming, Simon.
Thank you for asking me.
We're going to talk about a number of things, from the Supreme Court and the proroguing of Parliament, your new book, which is out, about the home front during the First World War. But the first question I really want to ask you about is Brexit.
Yeah.
Do you think it's going to happen?
I do, but I think it'll happen by accident. If we don't manage to get a deal, and I find that hard to comprehend at this stage, if we don't manage to get a deal and we then leave without one, we've left.
Isn't there now a real danger, though, that the MPs, aided and abetted by an activist speaker and activist judges, passed a law revoking Article 50 and there's nothing we can do about it?
I wouldn't have thought there was a majority in the House of Commons to revoke Article 50. I think it's an act of insanity on the part of the Liberal Democrats that they've embraced this fundamentally anti-democratic policy, which says 17.4 million people are worthless. And I just don't think there are other Labour MPs to do that. I think there are too many Labour MPs who know what their constituents feel about Brexit and who know that they wouldn't have a prayer of being re-elected if they put their name to such a thing.
Fundamentally, there's going to have to be a general election.
Yeah.
It may be in 6 weeks, they may delay for 6 months, they may even manage to delay for 3 years. But I suspect when that comes, it's going to be pretty awesome to watch.
I'm a committed Brexiteer. I was a Brexiteer of such vintage that when I was 14 years old, I canvassed with a no sign in the 1975 referendum. So my own Brexit credentials are, I think, pretty impeccable. But I'm afraid I've always thought that Boris Johnson was a disaster waiting to happen. And what a sensible Prime Minister, I think, would have done when taking over in July would have been to have gone and engaged in serious negotiations with the European Union, rather than just pretending to do so, rather than engaging in what Cummings called a sham. And I don't think they'd have got anywhere, but at least that Prime Minister could have come back and said, look, I have in good faith gone to Brussels, I have in good faith negotiated, I have sought to obtain a deal that is acceptable to the House of Commons and to the British people, and they haven't wanted to play ball. And then he could have, leaving without a deal, while perhaps regrettable, although I don't necessarily know that it is regrettable, would have been seen as being something that was inevitable, rather than something that was an act of provocation on his part.
Now, you were fiercely critical of Boris's predecessor but one, David Cameron, and I think it's fair to say that I was fairly critical of Cameron too. I left the Conservative Party when he was at the helm. You, I think, probably saw through Cameron ahead of many of the rest of us. Do you think this is another example of that?
I think this is far worse. I think Johnson, who used to work for me, he worked for me 25 years ago on the Telegraph, he's never been reliable, he's never had a grasp of detail. And I fear that it's his lack of grasp of detail has led to him appointing Dominic Cummings, who I don't know Dominic Cummings, we've never had the pleasure of meeting each other. But Cummings, to me, seems to be a soi-disant anarchist. But in politics, while it's always refreshing to confront problems, you also have to persuade people.
He was quite good at persuading voters in the referendum, wasn't he?
Cummings?
Yes.
No, I've always attributed the referendum victory to Nigel Farage.
Have you?
Yes, of course, because Farage persuaded the working class Labour supporters in large quantities to vote to come out of the European Union.
So if there was a general election and we hadn't yet left the European Union and it was clear that it wasn't Boris who had been the roadblock to us leaving, it was MPs and the courts, would you urge people to vote for the Brexit Party or for Boris?
Yes, I would.
Even if that meant that it might mean that there was a Corbyn government at the end of it?
I don't think there's any prayer in there being a Corbyn government. I think anybody, I may live to regret those words, but Corbyn is a man who is held in contempt by 80% of the British people. They are not going to make him Prime Minister.
Well, it's presumably it's got to be either Corbyn or Boris Johnson.
Well, has it? If the Labour Party and the Conservative Party lose a substantial number of seats because of a Brexit Party intervention, and the Liberal Party win a lot of those, Liberal Democrats win a lot of those seats, which I think could happen. I don't know that the Brexit Party will necessarily win very many, if indeed any seats. They might win Clacton. I don't think you can trust the Conservative Party, certainly not under Johnson. I don't think, you yourself have just talked about the possibility of May Mark IV coming back. That's precisely why he can't be trusted, because there's a chance he will bring Labour Mark back, and that isn't what the public want.
I have often thought, since I left the Conservative Party about almost 5 years ago to the day, that perhaps the problem with politics in this country is the Conservative Party, or certainly the Conservative Parliamentary Party. And I often used to marvel at how millions of people would vote Conservative in the expectation that they were voting for people who thought and believed in what they did. And then when I became an MP, I realised that actually many of the members of the Parliamentary Conservative Party regarded as a sort of infernal nuisance these Conservative supporters, certainly the Conservative activists, party members, but also the Conservative voters. They thought they were sort of actually rather uncouth, rather boorish, rather uncivilised. On things like law and order, for example, MPs in the House of Commons would routinely explain to me how Conservative voters' views on law and order were abhorrent to them. And I used to think, hang on, why didn't you announce this publicly before the election?
I think there is a problem with the sort of person, generally speaking, who becomes a Conservative MP today. But I think it's a problem that's also in different forms in the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats. The problem with our political class is that it is very out of touch with the people it represents. You only have to see how the Labour Party still haven't grasped that I think 60% of the seats that they hold in Parliament have a Leave majority in them, and they want to be a Remain party. I mean, they just simply don't get it. The Conservative Party, I think, in Parliament, many of them do have a certain amount of disdain for their voters, and I think if you read in the history, that's been true over most of the last 100 years. So I think that is a problem. But to me, the real problem is the selection committees in all the parties who choose candidates. I think they choose people who don't have the worldliness and the experience and the bottle age, if you like, to become decent MPs.
I think there's also an issue of time. I remember when I got elected in 2005, I got elected with a cohort of MPs who were keen as mustard to be in the House of Commons, full of ideas, full of ambition. And I don't want to be unkind, but I look at some of those MPs now from the 2005 intake. Some of them realise they're never going to lose their seats because it's a one-party fiefdom. They've completely stitched up the local association because they've probably been an MP there now for longer than the average member of their association. They've basically got a fiefdom and a sinecure. And they become entirely self-referential and entirely self-absorbed. And they're not the sort of people with the sort of attitude that they were when they got it.
Well, this is why I've never objected to the idea of reselection or deselection. I don't think it should necessarily, as in the Labour Party, be automatic. But I would encourage any Conservative association who's got a member of Parliament whom they think is either complacent or idle or ceasing to represent them. If that's how they want to conduct their politics, then they might be looking for another job. I take seriously Burke's idea, going back 240 years now, that a politician is the representative and not the delegate of his constituents. But of course, when Burke said that, he probably only had about 50 or 60 voters in his entire constituency.
And of course, Burke was subsequently thrown out by those voters in Bristol. He gave this great speech about how he wasn't going to listen to the electorate of Bristol, and then the electorate of Bristol decided that they wanted someone else.
So I think in this day and age, when you've got mass voting, universal suffrage, it's all very well to get the idea that you know better than your constituents, but it's very foolish of you to ignore your constituents.
One of the reasons why I became a big champion of open primary candidate selection and indeed recall was precisely because you want to put in place a mechanism so that even the stupidest, most complacent Labour or Tory MP in a safe seat will wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning some days and think, cripes, I better not fall out with local people.
Yeah, I agree with that. And we've come a long way from the days when MPs would treat their constituents with disdain. I remember about 20 years ago going to speak in Beaconsfield, and I was told by the then chairman of the Beaconsfield Association that they found the minute book from I think 1922 or 23, and it included a reference to one of the items on the agenda was planning for the annual visit of the member to the constituency. those days have gone.
But Beaconsfield's not had a terribly good track record in selecting candidates. I think they had one MP who had a bit of
Yes.
cash for questions trouble,
Now,
and then a grief for Beaconsfield.
now they have Mr. Grieve.
Yes.
Well, I mean, obviously people at Beaconsfield have got to decide whether they think Dominic Grieve has represented them in the way that they want. And if they don't, well, tant pis, as we say.
I think Tony Blair once was a Labour candidate in Beaconsfield, didn't he?
He did in the by-election caused by the death of Sir Ronald Bell in 1982.
Now, I think there's a consistent theme in some of your books and certainly some of your journalism, and it's about the extent to which there are apparently idiots in charge. You've written a book now that could almost be said to be looking at how there were idiots in charge of the country 100 years ago during the First World War. We today tend to think of Asquith and Lloyd George as these sort of heroic figures at a time of great national sacrifice. But tell me a bit about the book. What really happened? What were things really like? What were the people in charge like?
The book is the third of what will be a 4-volume history. It's called Staring at God, and it's a social, political and cultural history of Britain during the Great War, which I wrote partly because I'm writing a sequence of books from covering British history from 1838, the year when the Anti-Corn Law League starts, to 1939 when the Second World War breaks out. A century in which I think saw more traumatic change in this country than at any time, possibly since the Reformation, possibly since the Norman Conquest.
So it's almost like a sequel to The Age of Decadence.
It is exactly a sequel. It follows on The Age of Decadence. And Asquith, who was in charge when war broke out in 1914, was a thoroughly upright, decent man. He had his foibles. He drank too much. He was very interested in much younger women. But in terms of doing his job, he did it honestly and properly. But he never really adapted to a state of total war. And by 1916, we were in total war. Every man below the age of 41 was called up for service unless he was medically unfit or a conscientious objector, in which case he went to prison. And almost every woman in the country was involved in the war effort. They were either working in munitions factories or other factories that were essential to the war effort, or they were working on the land. The Women's Land Army started in the First World War, not the Second, as many people wrongly believe. And Lloyd George, who was randomly ambitious, looked at Asquith and thought, you're not up to it. You don't understand the demands of total war of a society that has committed itself to war. The decision-making process in government was poor because he was still using a cabinet of 20 people. Lloyd George said you need a cabinet of 3 or 4 people to do all this.
I think I'm right in saying there hadn't been a meeting of the chiefs of staff to consider seriously the threat of Germany since 1910 or something.
Yes, I mean the whole thing was amazingly complacent. And so he launched what was effectively a coup d'etat in December 1916 to get rid of Asquith on the grounds that Asquith wasn't taking the right decisions.
News of Boris against Asquith's May.
Yeah, but what happened then was Lloyd George took a series of very bad decisions. He agreed that we should take part in the Battle of Arras and the Vel Offensive, which was catastrophic. He signed up, he agreed with Sir Douglas Haig that we should have the Third Battle of Ypres, Passchendaele, which was a disaster. And of course he always blamed other people for his own mistakes, something that he wasn't the last politician to do. But having seen, and it wasn't anything to do with him, the carnage on Somme when he was Secretary of State for War, and then having seen what happened at Arras and at Passchendaele, he decided in the winter of 1917-18 that there were quite a lot of soldiers either on leave or being trained here, and young men under the age of 19 who were stationed at home, and he refused to send them to France, even though numbers in France were very short. He said, I'm not doing it because I don't want Haig to kill any more of our soldiers. The trouble is, he did this at a time when intelligence sources were telling him that the Germans, having stopped fighting the Russians, who had conceded at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and there was no Eastern Front left, were moving something in the region of 40 divisions from the Eastern Front to the Western Front with a view to attacking us. And the intelligence people said to him, not just that these people were going to fight against us, but they were going to fight against the British sector, not the French. And so our sector was attacked in March 1918, and the advance went 50 miles before it stopped. And Lloyd George, who fought an election that December after the armistice, on the slogan that he was the man who won the war, was actually very nearly the man who lost the war, because if the Germans' supply lines had collapsed and the Germans had been forced into a retreat in northern France in the late spring, early summer of 1918, they would have got to Paris and the war would have been over.
Do you think that there's any, I mean, I know history that's counterfactual is by definition pointless, but do you think there's any merit in the idea that actually Britain could and should have sat out of the First World War?
It certainly wasn't really our quarrel, and it was. I think there was hoped, and I deal with this in great depth in the opening chapter of my book, that there'd be a repeat of 1870, when the Franco-Prussian War took place, and that we would spectate a fight between these two great continental powers, which of course ended in the formation of the German Second Reich, and in the humiliation of France and the loss of the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. But once the Russians got involved, and the Austrians, they got involved with the Austrians wanted to have a fight in Serbia, and the Germans said to Austria, well, you know, you must do what you have to do and we'll support you. And the French decided that they had to come in on the path of the Russians. We were in a very difficult position, and Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary, during July 1914, repeatedly told Paul Combon, who was the French ambassador here, that we would not fight. The Entente Cordiale was a diplomatic understanding, it wasn't a military understanding, and that we would not fight unless British national security was imperiled. What of course made us fight was the German ultimatum to Belgium to allow German troops to pass through Belgium to fight the French. And Belgium was guaranteed, or its independence and neutrality were guaranteed by the Treaty of London of 1839, of which we were one of the three signatories, between France and Germany. And at this stage, we're not the most powerful country in the world. We are the third most powerful economically. The Germans and the Americans have overtaken us. But we are militarily the most powerful in the world because of our navy. We have the greatest navy in the world. And everybody expects that there's a war, that it's going to be the name of winning by blowing the enemy's fleet out of the water. But given our position internationally, if we refuse to fulfill our obligations under the Treaty of London, then our word means nothing, and our international credibility is destroyed. And that was the only reason that we fought the war. We didn't go in because France was our ally. We went in because we had an obligation under a treaty to do so. And the Germans, the French said they would abide by the Treaty of London, they would not compromise Belgian neutrality and go to Belgium to fight the Germans. But the Germans did not respect that neutrality and we had to fight them. Otherwise, as an international power, we're largely finished.
You write in your book, and I don't think I've come across a book like it, about the home front. It's not just a question of battles and military planning, but about the effect of the war on the home front. And there's not a town or village in the country where there's not a war memorial.
Actually, there are actually about 20.
Really? Maybe
more than that. Yes, they were called, there was a name for them, it was something like Golden Villages or something.
Really?
There are a couple of dozen where there's no war memorial because no one died. I mean, there's hardly.
Yeah, but that's the exception.
That's out of 50,000 civil parishes.
Yeah.
So almost everywhere is affected.
And I mean, quite often we're so used to seeing these war memorials, we sort of just pass them by. But actually, if you stop and think about it, the part of Essex I used to represent, you would go to a relatively small village, and there would be 20 to 40 names on it, and in a small village, 20 to 40 families grieving. I mean, the psychological effect of it must have been catastrophic.
Well, yeah, and I find this so hard to understand why after an event such as the Somme, where don't forget 19,240 men were killed on the first day, I don't understand why we put up with it, why there wasn't some sort of uprising or revolution.
There was.
Well,
Ireland.
Well, yes, Ireland's a separate matter, and that wasn't because of the Somme. I mean, the Easter Rising had happened 3 months before the Somme, 2 months before the Somme. But, you've got towns around England where PALS battalions, Accrington, Bradford, Newcastle, Belfast, PALS battalions went over the top on the first day of the Somme and were almost obliterated. And within a week or two, when the letters and telegrams have started to arrive in these little towns, or sometimes quite big cities, women go out shopping and every other woman that they meet is wearing black because they too have been bereaved. And there's a story in my book about a department store in Chelmsford, where I grew up in Essex, where they reported by about the middle of September, I think it was, that they'd run out of crepe because so many women had come in asking for black crepe to make mourning clothes out of. Obviously that society took the ritual of death much more seriously than we do. And they had run out of it and couldn't get any more. The supplies were simply exhausted. And you've got women in some of the towns with the powers of the planet, Accrington I think was one, where they suddenly realised that there has been a Holocaust. That almost every young man who's gone off to fight has been killed or wounded. And they besieged local newspapers.
Is this where the phrase, the title of your book, Staring at God?
No, that came from a different source.
It's a quote from
It's a quote from Mrs. Asquith, yes. I was in the Bodleian Library 3 years ago reading Mrs. Asquith's diaries, which are brilliant up until the time when her husband is thrown out as Prime Minister at the end of 1916. After that they become pretty erratic and she goes slightly mad because she's so outraged at the way her husband's been treated. But
she wouldn't be the first.
She wouldn't be the first. But on the 5th of August 1914, when Lord Kitchener has just been made Secretary of State for War, Mrs. Asquith sees him in Downing Street and tells him that we're going to have a great and swift victory. And Kitchener says, well, I beg to differ, it's going to take 3 years. And she can't believe this. And by the end of October, her entire mindset has changed. She realises that Kitchener is right. And she, in her diary, writes about how difficult things have been before the war, when there had been a real breakdown of stability, largely over Ireland and over the House of Lords, between the Liberal and Conservative parties. These people always used to meet in society, and then suddenly they stopped doing so. And she said, this war has caught us at our worst. What the problem was in 1914 was that everyone assumed it was going to be a sea war. They assumed that the German fleet, we had the biggest navy in the world, and so it was assumed that the German fleet would come out of harbour, come into the North Sea, and try and invade. And the Royal Navy would just wipe them off the face of the sea. And that didn't happen. They didn't come out until Jutland.
Pesky enemy didn't do what we wanted.
Yeah, they didn't come out until end of May, beginning of June 1916 at Jutland, which was a score draw. Jutland, we didn't have a clear victory at Jutland for the simple reason that quite a lot of, it was a warm day, it was summer, and quite a lot of the ships had the doors open between their magazine and the engines. And so if they were hit, the magazines blew up and the blast went right through the ship. This is what prompted Sir David Beatty, who was the Vice Admiral number 2 in the hierarchy under Jellicoe, to turn to his flag officer and say, there's something wrong with our bloody ships today, as he saw one dreadnought after another blowing up. But once we'd sunk a few German ships at Jutland, they didn't come out of harbour again, and it allowed us to enforce the blockade that effectively starved Germany into submission in 1918. The lesson for today, I don't know. We haven't really got a navy left, unfortunately. We've had successive governments that have run down our armed forces scandalously to the bone. The one lesson I would like any Prime Minister, and who knows how long the President will be in office, to do would be to put more men and women in the army, to build more ships and to build more aircraft.
But if you look at what the British state is doing, we're making decisions to seize tankers near the Straits of Gibraltar, and yet when you get pushback and consequences of that, with British ships then being intercepted in the Gulf, it's almost as if no one in Whitehall has sat down and thought, what are the consequences of our actions going to be, and what equipment and military capability do we need to respond?
I know, I was criticised some time ago by someone in the MOD for writing, this must be 3 or 4 years ago, about the decision to send, I think, 600 or 650 men of the Yorkshire Regiment to, I think it was Estonia. to show that we were prepared to defend the EU's border with Russia.
600.
Or with Belarus, 600.
Moscow must have been terrified.
Well, I said to my friend in the MOD, look, this is ludicrous. If you send 25,000 men, fair enough. But 600, they haven't even got to kill them, they've just got to run them up and kidnap them. It's absurd. I think Russia is a real threat to this country. I think they've got a very unstable leadership. They are, in economic terms and population terms, declining rapidly.
But like the Ottoman Empire, it's their weakness that is the cause of the problem, fundamentally.
Absolutely. And at some stage, I fear Putin is going to want to flex his muscles. Mm-hmm. He still has a nuclear armory. I don't want to go down that road. But if we're going to show our potential enemies that we are a force to be reckoned with, we have to have that force to be reckoned with. And that means a bigger army, a bigger navy, and a bigger air force. And why we have an overseas aid budget that is largely squandered when that money could be used to build ships and to build aircraft and to put men and women under arms in the army, I don't know.
It's almost to me as if, if we're going to do Brexit, we're going to become self-governing. But if you're going to become self-governing, you've got to decide whether or not you're going to be a serious player in the world affairs. And so you need to rediscover the basic elements of statecraft. I mean, I was talking to a very high-ranking British diplomat a couple of years ago, and I was listening to them talking to a round table discussion full of grandees like them. And they were talking about British foreign policy in terms of tackling climate change. And I thought to myself, where is this hard-nosed sense of what is our national interest? Where is someone in Whitehall sitting there and thinking, G5, this is game-changing technology, the Chinese have worked out what they're going to do about it, the Americans have worked out what they're going to do about it, what are we going to do about it? It's almost as if there's no one in government, there are no institutions at the heart of the British state that are behaving in this hard-nosed strategic way.
Well, I agree, and because of the disgraceful failure to implement Brexit over the last 3 years, this country, this government, has done virtually nothing.
Yeah. Well, Simon, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
Thank you for talking about your book. I will make sure we put a little strap line, and I hope it powers your sales into the top of the Amazon charts.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.